first.
Okay. All right. We started the Grandparent Huddle for a few reasons. This year we have 3 goals. One is to be a prepared grandparent, a praying grandparent, and then a connected grandparent. So I'm going to be the preparing grandparent part. But each time we want to have kind of a time for Karen to share like a grandparent tip or hack or something that we have done with our grandkids or plan to do with our grandkids that might give you some ideas on just how to be connected with your grandchildren. So I'm going to have her come on up.
Good morning. Is this on? Can you hear me? Yep. So we have an update. Last month I told you about some dinner ideas we had, and over spring break our older grandsons didn't go anywhere, so we had them over for a fancy dinner. And it was so fun. We did a number of courses, and we had the multiple forks like I told you about. We had them put their napkins in their laps, and honestly they really responded well to it. It was very fun.
Yeah, they came over all dressed up. And
We told them to wear a collar.
brought her flowers, and yeah, it's really cool.
It was really sweet. It was really fun. So this next month we're going to try that mystery dinner. I'll let you know.
Each of their first bite of salad went right in. And they didn't know what to do.
It was fun though. It was really fun. But this month I thought we'd talk about spring. I think it's going to come, and Easter. So Easter, what we want to do is talk about how we can incorporate our faith with our grandchildren, but not a heavy push. And I think Easter is our time to shine. Joe and I both, as you can see, are going to talk about some books, but I also want to mention some things we can do in the spring with our grandchildren, just being present. One would be when the weather finally gets nice, to go for a walk, maybe to take them out for ice cream, to check in and how are they doing in school. Is there anything maybe you can help with homework? Maybe just a study break depending on their age, but looking for opportunities to connect now that it's spring, I think is part of what I wanted to share with you. But the book part, I love books. I think we've talked about this before. And so I have a couple samples to show you. Easter is a little bit tricky. It's kind of like Christmas, where the main character is not a religious character, right? So culturally, Easter is about Easter bunnies and Easter eggs. And instead of like pushing up against it too strong, let's talk about how we can kind of roll with it. So I would say probably to my oldest 4, tell me about what Easter means to you, and what about spring is, why is spring and Easter connected? And so then that's your opportunity to kind of talk about new life, new opportunities. Of course, Easter eggs, you can talk about the empty tomb with those, but I would ask more questions than try to give information. Another question might be, why do you think this culture focuses so much on an Easter bunny when really the story is about Christ and his rising from the dead? You know, just kind of planting little questions in their mind, not pushing, but just letting them share something. So one of my favorite books is this Tale of the Three Trees, the bigger one. Probably you guys had this when, I love that we're all kind of the same age, so you might remember this when your kids were growing up.
I'll be like Dana White.
So the Tale of Three Trees talks about how 3 trees were used in Christ's life. One, the cradle, one, the boat that Joe just talked about last week, and finally the cross. So I love that. This next one is one of my favorites, and if you'll open up the parable of the lily, remember this is like old, this is 90s old. Open it up so you can see how Becca She's excited when she was little. So I love this story though because it tells about a young girl who got a gift from her dad, and when she got it, it didn't look like something she wanted, and she kind of pouted, and she put it in the basement, and it was an Easter lily. And so then, the story goes on a little bit. I thought about reading it, but it's gonna be too long. So she ends up getting angry and she throws it outside and it lands in the garden, and then Easter morning, the Easter lily grows. And so, again, talking about ways that God shows himself in a new life with Easter. This one I just bought for us to talk about. It's a pretty good one. It's on Amazon. I think it's like $77.99. And some of you with families out of town, it could be something you just mail right to them. But it's the Easter story. We both read it and feel like it's pretty solid theologically. There's some weird ones out there. One we read was the garden, the cross, and the curtain. It was weird. So I would kind of take a look at them before it was weird. Take a look at them before you give them to somebody, but we really like that one. Another thought was our Daily Bread has a coloring book, and it has puzzles and stuff. So that could be another thing that you would send grandchildren. The thing about, yes. Oh, yes. The thing about books is I like to be known to read to the grandchildren, and also, and hear me on this, it could be an ending of a visit, right? So the kids are all hanging around and you're kind of getting tired and you don't know when they're gonna leave. I might say, hey, how about I read this story, and then before you go, how about I read this story? And then everybody feels complete, right? So
that's a little weird when I say, let's close in prayer.
Okay. So the final thing is this little puzzle. For those of you with kids out of town, and we talked about flat letters last time, I just picked this up at Hobby Lobby. You could write a note on the back, I love you, I'm so proud of you, that kind of stuff, and then break it up and put it in an envelope and mail it, and that might be a fun thing for a grandchild to get out of town. Or you could make your own with just using cardstock, and print out a picture and then cut it up neatly so they can make a puzzle depending on their age. Okay?
That's it?
That's it.
Great, thanks. Okay, those books will be up here afterwards along with these. I'll explain these. All right, so for those of you who are new, what we've been doing is, it struck me when I was walk my neighborhood almost every day. And a couple of my neighbors have the yard signs that say, in this house, Black Lives Matter, no human is illegal, love is love, science is real. We've been going through one at a time because those are the statements that your grandchildren, that are going to challenge your grandchildren's faith. And so I wanted us as grandparents to be prepared, maybe to talk about those particular, you use those signs as a kind of a jumping off place to talk about our faith. All right, so today is Science is Real. All right, Science is Real. Whenever I read that, I think, and I think it's correct, that when I read that, I always think that is as opposed to faith. Like science is real as opposed to faith. And so, I always try to think of dividing up any kind of talk into 3 points. And I struggle with this one. There's a lot of stuff here, but these are my 3 points. When it wasn't a problem, when it became a problem, and the 2 biggest problems with the problem. So, this morning, we have a problem. Those are going to be, this is the big thing, all right? So, when it wasn't a problem. One of the things I would tell my grandkids, if they see that and they say, Papa, what does that mean when it says science is real? I say, well, it's usually trying to say that science is real and faith is not. That they want to go with empirical evidence. When it was not a problem was a lot of people don't know, is that modern science was founded mostly by Christian scientists who were Christian. I almost said Christian scientists, but that it's me, scientists who were Christians. And when you do research, like if you want to Google early modern scientists, you will find that were Christian. You'll find a list of 35, 45, 50, sometimes 60 different scientists. Everybody from Isaac Newton to, Francis Bacon was the father of the scientific method. Of course, Isaac Newton was gravity. You got Boyle with Boyle's law, if you know anything about thermodynamics. And then there's just a ton. And the reason that they gave, the thing that ushered in modern science, was the idea that God had created a universe that reflected his character. That God was ordered, that God was logical, that God was faithful. So they felt like they were probably the reason that you could be safe in this universe, the way God created it, is because he created it to obey certain laws, and he was the lawgiver. And so they went about trying to discover what we call the laws of nature. Okay? That was what ushered in modern science. No other culture, no other worldview ushered in modern science. It was the Christian worldview, right? So that's when it wasn't a problem. So that's one of the things that I want to point out to my grandkids, to say, you need to know that when modern science first started, modern science and faith coexisted. They were very, very closely. Not only coexisted, what scientists believed was that whatever they discovered in the universe would point them to the glory of God, that they would find out more about God when they investigated the way the world was made. When it became a problem, the problem it actually started in 1859 with the publication of Charles Darwin's book, The Origin of the Species. That didn't really lead to it right away. What happened was that philosophy entered into science, and philosophers entered into science. And the philosophy was naturalism. Now, there was always this idea of naturalism. Naturalism is the philosophy that only things that you can see, hear, smell, taste, and touch actually exist. Things that you can prove through the scientific method exist. Those are the only things that actually exist, because everything else you have to take by faith. Right? So that's naturalism. Charles Darwin, in The Origin of the Species, gave them a vehicle where they felt like science then could exist on its own, and that you could explain everything in our world and in our universe based on the scientific method and things that you could see, hear, smell, taste, and touch, that there was no need for the supernatural, which is a different way of saying something other than naturalism, something that goes beyond our particular, the physical world. Energy and matter. Like the entire universe is made up of those two things, energy and matter. Right, so 1859, I'm going to give you a lot of information because I can't avoid it. So you can listen, try to take notes. You can come up here afterwards, look at these books and see if there's any of those that interest you. That I have probably 4 shelves of books in my office that have to do with science and the evidence that we have and what I'm going to talk about. At the risk of sounding like I'm shelving my own books, I wrote a book based on a series I did called Christianity, Fact or Fiction. If you've been around a long time, you might remember that. And so it's called Smooth Stones. It will give a lot of this information in a very simple way, so you can have it. And it's going to be over there at the end if you want to get it. All right. So, what was it? All right. Naturalism, Charles Darwin. Okay. So that's where faith and, they decided that they could explain everything based on the physical world. That's naturalism. And they thought that Charles Darwin gave them the vehicle where that was now plausible. So that was 1859. For the next about 70 years, scientists really built their entire philosophy of naturalism based on the idea of a static universe. A static universe was that for 200 years of the beginning of modern science up until 1905-ish, believed that the two things that had always existed were matter and energy. That since those were infinite and had always existed, that meant that all science had to prove was how those organized themselves, the matter and energy organized themselves into where non-living things became living things and how the simple became more complex. Okay, those were the two problems. All right, and I say that in 1905 something began to change. And in 1905 was when Albert Einstein came up with the theory of relativity. Now the theory of relativity, and please know, my degrees are in psychology and biblical literature, not in science. So everything that I'm giving you is probably, if you're a scientist, I have a thin veneer of, I'm like cheap furniture when it comes to science. I have a thin veneer of knowledge. So the theory of relativity, but this is what I know about the theory of relativity, that when Albert Einstein was putting that together, he kept making a simple mistake in math, and the equation didn't work. And a guy named Alexander Friedman, who was a mathematician in Russia, wrote him repeatedly, telling him, the mistake you're making with your equation is an elementary school mistake. You're dividing by zero right here. And finally, Albert Einstein wrote him back, and he said, I've known that for a while. Later on in his life, he called this the greatest mistake of his scientific career, because he let the philosophy of naturalism make it impossible for him to finish off the equation. Because once he finished off the equation of the theory of relativity, he realized that that meant, if his equation was correct, that at some point in the past, there was no energy, there was no matter, and there was no time. Right? When he finished off that equation, his big epiphany was this, and this is what he said. He said, if this is true, and I believe it is, it means the question for science is no longer how or when, the question is who. Because that meant that there was a creator. Now, that was in 1905. Let me get these times right. In 1927, a guy named Edwin Huddle made a telescope. You know the Huddle telescope is still in existence, or it has been morphed into a more powerful telescope. But Edwin Huddle, he observed something that he called the red shift. What he observed was that the light that was coming from stars, when it was passed through a prism, shifted to the red part of the color spectrum, which meant that the sources of the light, the stars themselves, were moving further away, which meant that the universe was expanding, which was a bombshell for the science community, because that was another kind of indication that the universe as we know it had a beginning. And of course, if the universe had a beginning and there was no energy and there was no matter and there was no time, then the question is, where did that come from? All right. Then in 1964, there were two scientists named Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson who observed what's called the cosmic radiation background echo. And what it is that you know how on the 4th of July, when it's dark and a firework goes off, it explodes, you can see the kind of the outline of the explosion for a little bit, and then it slowly disappears. And that's called a radiation echo. And what they found was that in the middle of the universe, there was this huge cosmic radiation background echo. It later on it was given the name the Big Bang, which you probably heard of. The Big Bang, actually, that phrase was given as a term of derision by a scientist who was making fun of it because he didn't want it to be true, which he said later on. But the Big Bang is the idea that at one time there was nothing, and then there was something. What's interesting is that what happens with science is that it ended up pointing to the thing that the Bible has said right at the beginning. In the beginning, by the way, this is interesting. The Bible is the only religious literature that says that God exists outside of time, that there was a beginning when there was nothing. And science now says the same thing. Now, that's one of the big problems with the separating faith and science and saying science proves that naturalism is the way to go, and then faith is going beyond, and there's no evidence for faith. The problem with that is that if you would open this is here. I'm going to explain this in a bit. This is actually I'll explain it by the way now. I had Karen make this coffee cake, and it's in this lid. And what this whole thing represents is this is naturalism. The idea that everything is contained. So if there's a cake in there and there's nothing outside, we believe that you have to explain the existence of the cake by only using the evidence that you have inside of this. Then you'll come up with a theory very much like the theory of origin with science right now, with some science. Oh, listen, I'm going to keep remembering things. I love this whole subject because science is so much on our side. There are more. I mentioned this guy a few weeks ago in a sermon. He's a friend who got his PhD in what is it? It was really on blood clotting. He graduated first in his class at CCC, first in his class at Kent State, went to the University of North Carolina, got his PhD, graduated top of his class there, and the very first job he got was at Harvard University. Wow. But Nathan would tell me that there are more Christians in the science department at Harvard than there are in the religion department at Harvard. Which is wild, right? Anyway, but part of this is the idea that, okay, the first problem with science being naturalistic is that at one point there was nothing in here. There was no flour. There was no all the ingredients. There were 24 ingredients in this coffee cake. So there was nothing like it. So the question then is, how did nothing become something? Because science knows that something doesn't come from nothing. I mean, science tells us that. So what they did, this is the idea now. The idea is that there must be multiverses, like multiple universes. That's the theory right now. And the theory is that since there are multiple universes that we cannot see, hear, smell, taste, or touch, then it makes sense that one of those universes somehow provided the material that we have today that then created this universe. There is no real evidence for the multi-universe theory. The evidence that they have is this: we know we're here, so we must have got here somehow. Another little tidbit. A guy named Francis Crick, who was the co-discoverer of the DNA double helix, right? He figured out that life itself was so complicated. Like when I was in school, when I first learned to use a microscope, it was probably the same period of time for you. I remember learning about single cell life forms, parameciums, amoebas, right? I remember those. And the test was really simple because there are only like 3 or 4 parts to a single cell, which is what I was taught. There's a nucleus, there's a semi-permeable membrane, there's protoplasm, whatever that is, and then the membrane itself, right? That was it. I just got an A on that test. That was before they started making like microscopes the way they make them now. Now, this is one of these books. Let's see. Oh, no. Nope, didn't. Sorry. There is more happening in a single living cell, more activity than in the city of Chicago on a single day. That's what we know now. We know that a single living cell is more complicated than the modern city of Chicago. There's more happening in a single. It's mind-blowing. Anyway, Francis Crick figured that out. And but he was a naturalist. So he came up with a theory for how life came from non-living matter. And he called it theory of panspermia. Okay, pan meaning everywhere. Spermia is where we get sperm. What he says is this cracks me up. He says that the way that life began on Earth is that extraterrestrials seeded our planet with life. And that began the whole, and then evolution took over, and that's why and of course, the childhood question is what? Yeah, where did they come from? Right? Oh, I forgot the whole thing. All right, let me tell you this. Let me tell you why the problem is such a problem. Like, Stephen Jay Gould, who was at one point the world's foremost authority on evolution. He taught at Harvard. He was a professor of evolutionary biology. This is what he writes. He says, no scientific theory can pose any threat to religion, for those two great tools of understanding operate in totally separate realms. Science is an inquiry about the factual state of the natural world. Religion is a search for spiritual meaning and ethical values. Right? Which is, he was trying to just say, hey, they're two separate things. They're not connected. This is the problem with that. There are 4 basic questions of existence. Okay, here are the 4 questions of existence. Where did I come from? That's a question of origin. Where am I going? That's a question of destiny. Why am I here? That's the question of purpose. And how shall I live? That's the question of morality. Right? Where did I come from? Where am I going? Why am I here? How shall I live? All those questions are connected. Once you answer the first question, it leads to the second question, which leads to the third question, which leads to the fourth question. What Stephen Jay Gould was trying to do was to say, listen, science answers questions in one way, and really religion is supposed to answer the how shall I live and maybe why am I here. Here's the problem with that. As a Christian, tell me the answer to the first question. Where did you come from? Yeah, from the hand of a loving God. You were made in His image. Where are you going? Heaven or hell for all of eternity, because you were made with a soul inside of you. What is your purpose? To glorify God and enjoy Him forever. That's from the Westminster Catechism. How shall you live? Your morality then is based on all of those. Okay, now let's go through the same questions as Stephen Jay Gould, who believes in evolutionary biology, and that is the way that we came into existence. Okay, where did you come from? Primordial slime. As a pure, random act of chance. That's where you came from. Where are you going?
Back to it.
Worm food, dust to dust, right? Why are you here? That's the question. You can say whatever you want. Like they'll say, oh, to make the world a better place. Why? Why? What if I say, my purpose is to conquer as many people as I can? What if my purpose is to kill as many people as I can? What if my purpose is to give and make the world better? I mean, your purpose is really up to you. And that leads to the fourth question, which is how should I live? And the answer to that is how do you live? Right? Those questions are all connected. That's why it's so important to figure out, like this whole thing, this is what I would tell my grandkids, just say, okay, I would go through those four questions and say, okay, these are the way we answer it. This is the way science is, but I'll tell you the problem with science. And saying that it's evolution. Okay, gosh, I'm sorry, this is so so disorganized in my head. And I know it's coming out like that. But we're here now, we can't do anything about it. The evolution, there is evidence for microevolution. Microevolution happens all the time. That's what the origin of species really came out of. What the famous story of the origin of species is that Charles Darwin was in the Galapagos Islands and he observed finches, and the finches ended up having, the ones that survived had larger beaks, so they could survive during a drought, right? So that began the whole thing that microevolution happens, which is small changes among species. That's why you can have small dogs and big dogs. Now there are limits because you can't have a dog as small as a mouse, and you can't have a dog as big as a giraffe. Why? No, well, the problem is that there are genetic boundaries around species. Okay, so the problem with what happened was that then it said that if small changes can happen over a small amount of time, then really huge changes can happen over a long period of time. And what Charles Darwin would say is that paleontology, the study of history through the study of rocks and fossils and all that, will show the progression, and my theory will make or break based on the fossil record. And after a couple hundred years of paleontology, there's very little evidence of a gradualistic evolution. So now they have big jumps in evolution. I forget what they call it. Anyway, so that's the problem with, that's one of the problems. Let me get to the final thing. This is the biggest thing that's happening in the last maybe 30 years. I mentioned that this cake has 24 different ingredients. And one of the things that people are asking, this is what I explained to my grandkids, is that is there evidence for the existence of a maker? Like, for our world, for the universe, is there evidence for the existence of God? Right? And what is that evidence? So for this, there are 24 different ingredients that all have to be added in at a precise kind of measurement. If you get a measurement wrong, or you leave an ingredient out, it may not taste good. Like if you put the amount of sugar that's in here, which is probably an enormous amount, and you change the amount of sugar to the amount of salt, and the amount of salt to the amount of sugar, things would be very much different. If you cook it at 4,000 degrees instead of 400 degrees, it'll be very much different. If you cook it for 2 minutes, or you cook it for 48 hours, it'll make it. Everything has to be absolutely precise. That's why we follow recipes. Okay? In 1973, there's a guy named Brandon Carter, who was a PhD, who gave a paper in Krakow, Poland, to some cosmologists, and it ended up rocking the scientific world. And his paper was called the anthropic principle, from the Greek word anthropos, which means man. And what his basic premise, what he found out, and at that time he had like 14 different measurements in the universe that had to be absolutely precise, or there wouldn't be a single thing in the universe. Not a single thing. The strong nuclear force was one. The strength of gravity was another. The weak nuclear force, electromagnetism. Okay, all those things, like so precise that he was saying everything in the universe, the existence of the universe, seems like it was made with one thing in mind, and that's human life. That's what Brandon Carter said. Since then, that number of precise measurements has grown to over 70 precise measurements, which scientists are saying makes it almost, well, it does, like with physics, the number that where something becomes so improbable that it is impossible is like 1 times 10 to the 40th power. The idea that there are 70 exact measurements in the universe is like 1 times 10 to the 40,000th power. Physics would say that is an impossibility for the universe to form by chance, that there has to be something outside of the universe that actually created the universe. So, all that to say, with my grandkids, I would say this is the way modern science started. Modern science started with people believing that God was amazing. And that the more they would learn about the earth and the way it was made, about life, about the stars, about the universe, about the size of the universe, everything that they learned would help them understand and give glory to God. That's the way modern science started. Modern science then lost its way when they tried to decide that nothing outside of what you can see, hear, smell, taste, or touch, no matter what the evidence points to, like the evidence for there being a God is overwhelming. Like, well, for something outside of the natural world, overwhelming. The pushback for a lot of scientists is to say, well, there is something that is out there that actually created, but we don't want it to be intelligent, rational, and all-powerful, because then it would be God, and at that point, oh, me. There's a lot of stuff. A guy named Sir Aldous Huxley, who was Darwin's right-hand man. He was called Darwin's bulldog. he ended up making a statement towards the end of his life where he said, the reason evolution was so attractive is because I wanted to live the way I wanted to live. And I didn't want anyone, particularly God, to tell me how, because he said, basically, he said I wanted to live a sexually active, debaucherous life. Wild ambition. So I would start with that not start with that, but I would say, this is when modern science started. If you follow the arc of the evidence, as science has done its job in trying to figure out exactly what happened in the universe those trillion years ago, however long ago, what you will find is that the evidence that cosmologists have now point back to the exact same thing that modern science was founded on. That everything in our universe, everything that science can discover, is pointing to the glory and wonder of a God who created this out of nothing, which is Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. So, when I pass by like that sign, for me, and part of it is because this really interests me, so I read a ton about it. I will just jump it. We are so great. Science and Christians are in such a powerful position with science, and with that particular one, where they say science is real and faith is not. There's a guy who wrote a book called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, and he builds it basically on this idea. So, that's it. You can move to your discussion around your table, and then these books are up here afterwards. The coffee cake is up here. You can have it now. But that's Science is Real, right? And next week is going to be next month will be Love is Love, that's probably one of the more difficult ones that we're facing that your kids and grandkids are going to fix. All right?